Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Last week, we talked top 5 fraudulent races, times the FIA scammed us all out of the beauty of the sport in whatever race we were in for that weekend, right? This week, a little bit different, but we're sticking with the top 5 list this week. Top 5 events that rewrote Formula One history for one reason or another.
Yeah, and these are going to be not just specifically races per se, but, you know, like if a year popped up where a lot of different changes came out or whatever it is, we're going to get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to Turn 1 of Formula One podcast. We're your host, Thomas.
And Jeremiah.
So we said we have a top 5, which we do, and we're going to dive in depth into the top 5. But we want to start by giving you a couple honorable mentions and then just kind of listing the top 5. That way you know what's in store, and you can go ahead and start typing the YouTube comments away with whatever your thoughts are on these big events. So Jeremiah, what are our honorable mentions?
We're going to talk about the 1958 season, the 1983 season. We're going to talk about the sprint race editions of 2021 Belgian Grand Prix. We're going to touch back on that from last episode. And the 2002 team orders that we talked about last episode with fraudulent races.
Getting banned in this case, right?
Yeah.
And then for our big 5, we're going to go back to 2021, Abu Dhabi, something that I think every modern F1 fan is aware of. The 2011 season, where we bring back in team orders, along with some other things. The 1968 season, the 59 Cooper tech advances, and the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix Crashgate.
Ooh.
All right, let's get into some of these honorable mentions. Jeremiah, what do you got?
So I talked about the 1958 season, and we're going to get into that. Just a little bit, just a little light touch. This one didn't make the list, but we did want to put it on here as an honorable mention because it was the first year that the Constructors' Cup was actually tracked. So before this, remember the Formula One as a series started in 1950. So
right.
For the first, 8 years, for the first 8 years, it was just the driver who was the best driver. And then it wasn't until 1958 that they started saying, okay, well, let's just see who can make the best car and who's the best driver.
Which I think that's critical for how we all think of Formula One, where it's not only a competition of skill with the driver position, but it's also the financial resource usage of the team and the engineering and the tech and the design. Like that's 50% of Formula One as we see it today, and them tracking that as like, okay, Mercedes did better than Ferrari this year.
Oh, yeah.
That's huge for these teams.
Yeah, it's 2 sports in 1.
It really is.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about allocating money based off who wins the constructors and which constructors are dominant or not dominant. Like all of that started in 1958.
Right. All right, tell me about our next entry.
The 1983 Race of Champions. So prior to 1983, there were non-championship Formula One races. And these kind of baffled us for a while as we were learning about the sport. Like, why would you race in something that didn't count?
Exactly.
It'd be like an NFL team going and playing some game that didn't help them win a Super Bowl. Like, why would you do it? But as you read more into it, they did these non-championship races because it basically gave them a chance to go somewhere that wasn't on the F1 calendar. So they go to a new part of the world. They could set up a random one-time race somewhere. They would bring in a ton of new fans, and they could have drivers not in F1 competing against F1 drivers.
Okay, so I can see 2 upsides to this. One, you get to showcase your driver's skill level, and then the other one being just exposure.
Yeah, exposure, fans, and it would answer some of the hypotheticals back in the day, like, oh, what if you had an F1 driver versus a NASCAR driver, whatever. Today, the example might be, what if you had an MLB team go play a Japanese professional baseball team?
Yeah, or if you wanted to keep it in motorsports, I guess you could say what happened if you put F1 engineers where they built a car that was specifically meant to go around an oval and then put them up against an Indy car.
Yeah.
That would be cool.
So it doesn't quite get rid of all the variables. And one of the best examples that we were talking about earlier was like everybody in the U.S. for a while when Alabama was super dominant in college football, everybody's like, oh, Alabama could beat the Jacksonville Jaguars or the Miami Dolphins, who were like the worst in the NFL at the time. It's like, no, they couldn't, but it'd be really fun to watch.
Oh, yeah, because you've got a powerhouse like Alabama who's got a 5-star recruit at every single position. But then you got to remember that the absolute worst NFL team is full of NFL players.
The backups are the 5 stars.
The backups are the 5 stars that almost made it to the NFL.
So 1983 was the race of champions. It was the last time they held a non-championship race. I'm not saying that we necessarily need to bring that back. That's why it's an honorable mention, but it would be cool to answer the hypotheticals of today, putting Jimmy Johnson against Lewis Hamilton or something like that.
Okay. Let's talk about the 2021 edition of the sprint races.
Yeah.
So reason why I like this and a lot of people are against it, and that's fine. That's what the whole point of adding something is you're going to get some benefits and some negatives. But the reason I personally like the addition is, for one, you're just going to have more racing in general. But also the drivers who may not be doing so hot in the long stint race, somebody who maybe be able to get it out early if they didn't have to go as far because they had a great qualifying session or whatever, they get points towards their championship season. So the final total, they get points from these sprint races. So you could have, like, if Max Verstappen was to have an awful qualifying and he ended up in 20th, and then you had a Charles Leclerc Ferrari and he was in the pole position. In a sprint race, he might have a chance of taking that thing home. In a feature race, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. I think we had a lot of debate about this when they first started bringing in the sprint races, and it was because, like, they're offering 8 points to the winner, and that's a huge swing for points, right? Like, that's what, 6th place in a normal race?
Exactly.
So that's pretty big, and I think I'm okay with the sprint race format. I do kind of disagree that they needed it. So, like, NASCAR introduced, like, playoffs and stage racing whenever, like, NASCAR popularity dipped. F1 popularity is at an all-time high, so why change what's working? But I do wish the one change that they would make, I kind of liked it better when the F1 sprint was the qualifying for the race. I don't like it so much this year where the sprint is completely separated from the race.
Thing.
Yeah, it feels really weird to have qualifying and then a race and then a race.
Well, yeah, it just gives people, I guess, who had a bad qualifying another chance.
Yeah.
But regardless. All right, what's next?
Back to 2021. 2021 has 3 things that hit our list, either in the top 5 or the honorable mentions. 2021 Belgium Grand Prix, the rain out, the 2 laps under safety car, the fraudulent points that we mentioned last week.
We talked about this.
So we're not going to get into this one big time, but the reason that it changed F1 history is because they changed after that race how points are awarded for incomplete races, which incomplete races aren't uncommon. There's a couple every season due to rain or whatever that happens, red flags, time. And so the fact that they completely changed how they scale and tier the races based on percent finished all came from that one race, which is pretty big.
So we talked about 2021 Belgium in the last video. We also talked about 2002. What was it? I forgot what race it was now at this point, but it's basically in 2002, Schumacher and Barrichello were going against each other. Barrichello had the lead, and on the final lap, if I'm not mistaken, on the final turn, Barrichello was given the orders to let Schumacher through so that Schumacher could get a points advantage going into the season, or just in general in the Drivers' Championship. Oh, I'm struggling today. Regardless, we already talked about this, so I'm not going to mention it too much, but because of this race, they were kind of sickened by what they saw. Fans weren't happy, so they decided to ban team orders so that something like this could not happen again. Now, just a little fun little tidbit that has nothing to do with this video. Later on in that season of 2002, at the U.S. Grand Prix, Schumacher had the lead and purposely slowed down so that him and Barrichello could cross at the same time, and I have huge respect for Schumacher for that one.
That's pretty cool. And it was the 2002 Austrian Grand Prix where all that took place. Okay, let's get into our top 5. We'll dive into these a little bit more in depth as we can. And as always, this is our own personal research, which is just finding what we can online in articles and watching old videos. If you know something about these races that we miss or we get wrong, let us know. We're here to, I'll say educate loosely. We're here to inform, and if somebody likes listening to F1 content, we hope to provide that. But we also want to be accurate and correct with it. So if we mention something about the 2011 season that you're like, whoa, just let us know, and we'll fix it. 2021 Abu Dhabi. Man. So
where do you start?
So again, this is the third mention of 2021. We had the sprint races and we had the Belgian Grand Prix. 2021 is memorable for a lot of things. Everybody will remember it for the battle throughout the season between Max and Lewis and between Mercedes and Red Bull. There were, like Jeremiah mentioned earlier, there's two different sports almost competing at the same time because Mercedes was winning the constructors, Max and Lewis were fighting it out for the drivers, and it was coming down to Abu Dhabi really to see who would get both of those places. So if you are not familiar, you can obviously go back and watch the race, although watching the race alone won't give you the context for it. Go back and watch Drive to Survive. If you don't have a Netflix subscription, get one for a day just to watch like season 2 of Drive to Survive or season 3 of Drive to Survive and just watch the last episode or two because they really go behind the scenes as to how this race happened in real time. In 2021 and before, races were controlled by a race director, which was the single person running the operations of the race. They ran the stewards. They were essentially the FIA's person over the entire race. That is different than it is now, which I'll get to in a second.
Sure.
But as they go into 2021 Abu Dhabi, the last race of the year, Max and Lewis were tied at 394.5 or 395.5 in points, thanks to that 2021 Belgian Grand Prix. And essentially, it's a shootout for the championship. Whoever finishes higher wins the race. As they get to the last little bit of the race, I don't remember exactly. There was 2 laps left when they resumed, right? But 1 racing lap. It's like when the safety car left, there was one racing lap. So there was a safety car with a couple laps left, and there were cars in between Lewis in first place and Max in second place. 4 cars, I believe.
I hate this story so much.
I kind of love it as a Max fan, and I think our audience will share in our sentiments of hating it or loving it. So the rules at the time say that under safety car, lapped cars could unlap themselves. However, the race director could decide like, hey, due to time constraints or we want to get some more racing in, everyone's going to stay put, right? So either everyone unlaps themselves or no one unlaps themselves.
Exactly.
Michael Masi, am I right on his name? Michael Masi, the race director for 2021 Abu Dhabi, made his own custom interpretation of that rule. Basically, it's not cheating. He wasn't aiming for Red Bull to win, I don't think, but he could have been. He said only the lapped cars in between Lewis and Max could unlap themselves. So Max was on fresh tires, Lewis was on old tires, and essentially what he did was he set up a 1-lap shootout for the championship, but it gave Max the unfair advantage of not having to overtake the unlapped cars, and Max had fresh tires, so he essentially passed Lewis within 1 or 2 turns and took the championship.
I just want to know how much money was in that briefcase that Horner slid underneath the table to get that to happen. Because come on, man.
He's just sliding hundreds under the door.
Only the cars between Max and Lewis? Are you serious?
It literally only benefited Max.
Only?
It didn't benefit any other driver on the track except for Max. Because there were lap drivers between Max and whoever was in third place, and they didn't get to unlap themselves.
Now, Max got Lewis relatively early. Imagine if he had had 6 back markers that, yes, technically had to let him through, but they would have been blue flagged and he would have been slowed down at least a little bit.
I think he still would have gotten it, but it wouldn't have been on turn 1 or 2. It would have been at the end of the lap.
And that would have been more dramatic.
Would have been way
so
more
why would
dramatic.
you not want to have that as your ending instead of the BS
So
that played out?
As much as I like the result and as much as Jeremiah hates it, the FIA and Formula One did decide that that was not the way a season should end or should be run. They fired Michael Masi from that role. They said they moved him somewhere else in the organization. And then they said, we're going to completely redo how we run races. There isn't going to be a single race director anymore. There's going to be stewards, and there's going to be like a rotating group of people that control the races. So not one person is in charge of this decision. So if that same situation is to happen again today,
he needs a bunch of briefcases.
He needs a bunch of briefcases for a bunch of people to make the exact same decision on that event, which I just don't think would happen. There's too much oversight to it now.
Probably not.
But yeah, 2021 Abu Dhabi removed the single race director and decided a championship for Max Verstappen. What's next?
So for 2011, this was another one that could have had multiple different entries, and I kind of condensed them all into one just because I wanted to be able to get more stuff in there to fit in more into this top 5 list. So in 2011, the main hitters that happened is they had a different tire provider, they had new technological advances, and new rule changes. So for the tire provider, Pirelli now became the sole provider for F1. Before it was Bridgestone, and that contract ended, leaving Pirelli to be the sole provider. So now they're the ones that are in charge of everything as far as what the different kind of tires that are brought and everything else that entails for that. As far as technological advances, the DRS system got added, which is the drag reduction system. So what was special about this is that on straightaways, drivers who are within a second behind the driver in front of them at the detection zone, whenever they got to the straightaway or wherever the DRS activation area zone is, they could open up a small slit in the back wing of their car, which allowed more air to travel through, allowing them to not have as much drag on those straights, picking up more speed. This was huge because it added about 12 kilometers an hour, or for us Americans, about 8 miles per hour. It's a little bit less than that.
And I question that because I've seen those cars hauling it.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I'm not sure. This was in 2011.
Yeah.
I'm sure the advances are a lot different nowadays. But the final addition that happened in 2011 brings us back to what I just got done talking about in that 2002 season, is team orders were reinstated in the FIA rulebook. So now you were able to make those tough calls that you needed to make, or they had been making the entire time, but they were trying to hide. But the point is that they went back on the 2002 ruling. Team orders are now able to be used in an actual race. Pirelli is the main provider, and the DRS system, along with a couple other minor things, was added to allow overtaking and making that more of a possibility during a race.
Yeah, I think so. The sole tire provider for Pirelli is actually big, because before that there was usually multiple tire providers in a season,
right? Or
like they just wouldn't get contracts with somebody, but they would always try to have multiple contracts. The fact that we just have Pirelli today gives a lot of responsibility to one company to make the right tire compounds for the races. So that's a whole tech thing in itself.
Especially considering it's now 2023, and I'm talking about a rule that was instituted in 2011, and It still hasn't changed.
And then DRS, this was at a time when Formula One was starting to be considered boring by a lot of people. And that still will happen today. You have a race where just not a lot of action happens. Imagine a race with no DRS, no advantage to get an overtake. So you might have a train of guys in a slipstream for the entire race, and literally none of them can get the competitive edge on the people in front of them.
Which, granted, you still have DRS chains.
Right.
Or trains, but it's different now, because imagine a guy who didn't have DRS, whereas he might have been faster overall on a lap by 200ths or something like that. It might take him 6 or 7 laps in order to get an overtake done. But now if he's close enough on a back straight, he can take care of that guy in one turn, essentially.
As long as you're within a second, you can essentially make up that second in one straightaway
exactly.
In one turn, which is way more than you get in most
Huge.
laps. And then, like Jeremiah mentioned, the team orders ban. That's how we watch F1 today. Like, think of Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. Think of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, or Alex Albon or Pierre Gasly, like whoever they've been running with. They set up their main drivers, to win. I'm not going to say Lewis Hamilton and Nico, because they let Nico and Hamilton compete. But a lot of what we've seen in the post-2011 era has been teams running team orders to get their primary drivers wins.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you see it at Ferrari almost on a weekly basis in the race. You'll see if Carlos Sainz is faster than Charles Leclerc, then they'll let Carlos Sainz through and tell Charles to block for Carlos while he tries to close that gap on the car in front of them. I mean, this is something we see every single race. At least some team is implementing some sort of team order. And my final fact for team order that has nothing to do with this video, but it's just a little fun, is back in the day, team orders went a lot further than we thought it did. So much so as the team owner, if he wanted to, could make the executive team order decision to hop in the car and take it for the race if he deems that he needs to race for this race for whatever reason. I just saw that fact. I thought it was funny. If I end up being completely wrong on that, if you think that that's dumb, let me know down below.
You know, that could be going back to like when we were talking about like Bruce McLaren, right?
Exactly.
Like he was a driver. He made the car. He did all that. So maybe they're thinking, well, I could drive this better than this guy I've got driving it.
This guy's terrible.
Imagine Jerry Jones calling in from his suite at Cowboy Stadium.
Imagine Gunther Steiner.
Jerry Jones says, "Who's this left guard out here? Get him out. I'm subbing in."
Left guard? Jeez. Well, imagine Gunther Steiner just being like, all right, listen here, K-Mag, you're done. Pack your bags. I'm finishing out the season.
Hang up your helmet and walk out.
He walked up to his engineer and said, I need you to extend the car by about 4 inches.
I need the seat a little wider.
I need the leg room a little bit enhanced.
Oh, man. Okay. All right. Number 3 on our list, the 1968 season. This didn't have huge implications from like the racing spectacle or the rule changes, But this changed how we view F1, and this brought in an era of F1 that is still iconic in our heads. Picture an F1 car. What do you think of right now?
Marlboro. I knew where you were going
Marlboro
with it.
Or just Camel, the
I
Lotus
knew where
Camel,
you were going with it.
some cigarette ad or something. And even if you think about today where they don't have tobacco ads on cars, you picture the iconic Ferrari red, the Red Bulls on the car, the Mercedes logos trailing off and fading in the distance of the black background. All the teams are running sponsorship and logo deals for whoever they get money from. 1968 was the first season where Formula One cars had liveries based on sponsorships.
So what you're saying is before this, everybody just rode a tin can with wheels around the track.
Yeah, pretty much. The cars were very different back then, so you'd actually have like different looking cars on the track. You'd have some very sleek designs. You'd have very like oval, rounded shaped designs. And so if it was the Mercedes car, it would literally just be a silver painted car out there with nothing on it. It might have a Mercedes badge on the hood. I think I've seen pictures of that, but no sponsorships, no decals, no custom livery like we see today. And I found this funny. So the very first race to feature livery sponsorships was actually the 1968 South African Grand Prix, where a private team ran the Gunston Cigarettes livery.
Yes, the first livery.
And then the 68 Spanish Grand Prix, a few races later, Lotus, the first works team, runs out there with their new sponsored livery, Imperial Tobacco.
Oh, right. Sending the right messages.
So right when they're like, sweet, we can get sponsors, we can paint up this car, cigarettes and tobacco, let's go.
Like you can't say garage and cars without cigarettes.
But, I mean, the reason that's huge is, again, like Jeremiah mentioned, the first thing you think of when you think of F1 cars is the iconic red Marlboro car, the red and white McLaren, the red Ferraris, the blue and yellow Lotus that was just decked out in camel everywhere. Like, the only thing the car said was camel, like 8 different times.
Didn't even know what team it was. You could have thought it was Camel Racing.
So, I mean, just 1968 is just kind of what shaped money making, I think, in Formula One. That offered up a ton of opportunities for people to get their name out there.
1959. The Cooper Racing team starts to, and that could not be their name. I could have been wrong on that, so I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I think it's Cooper Racing. I'm pretty sure it's Cooper Racing. Regardless, they decided to throw out their invention or whatever they designed for 1959, and here is the first team in Formula One's history to introduce the rear engine. So the engine was set behind the driver. This allowed for a lot of different things. Number one, the vehicle was lighter, just because the amount of different structure that was needed to go from the rear of the car to the steering and everything at the front. Because while it might have been rear wheel drive, the engine was in the front, so that had to go all the way back to the rear drivetrain in order to rear axle to get all of that together. So that all added weight. Another thing that made it better, it was more agile. It could go into the turns better, and that's mainly just because the weight distribution on the car was a lot better. So instead of it being front heavy, it was now more centered, and it could actually handle these turns at a higher speed. So those are two things off the bat that in terms of Formula One being lighter and being able to go through turns faster, you're going to be worlds faster than everyone else. So Jack Brabham was the first one to take this thing in. He wins the 59 season with that Cooper car. And after that, 1961 and on, after the 1960 season, every single car out there has a rear engine, and understandably.
Yeah. It was the Cooper Car Company that Jack Brabham raced for. And like Jeremiah mentioned, once a team establishes something that works, it is quickly copied and implemented by everyone else. Think about the side pods that we have today, right? Like, we've had side pods for a while, but then Ferrari came out with their big, sweeping, huge side pods, and then everyone copies that. And then Red Bull has their powerful floor, and everyone copies that. Mercedes tries something new with zero pods, doesn't work, immediately goes back to what everybody else is doing that does work.
We'll see. And the thing is that it wasn't just that 1959 season that they were dominant. Jack Brabham also won in 60. So they had that back-to-back title with not just him as a driver, but using that piece of technology.
When was it more recently, too, that we had, was it Force India that completely copied the Mercedes car?
Pink Mercedes?
The pink
Yes!
Mercedes. So this was like the first instance. There was probably instances before that, but moving the engine is a huge design change.
Well, when you have back-to-back drivers champion Jack Brabham, who's driving the same piece of machinery with an engine in the back and no other car has that, you're going to catch on. But like I said, after that back-to-back title win by Jack Brabham, after 1960, every single car had the rear engine.
Was it just so that they could have a frunk so that they could store their helmet and gloves after the race?
That's where they kept their cigarettes.
Just open up, it's just Marlboro cigarettes pouring out of it.
And Camel, depending on what team.
Man, I love that. I love old school F1 stuff, and I like looking back at those cars. If y'all have a chance, go back and look at the Cooper T51. That just screams 1950s Formula One racing.
And if you want to see what a man looks like, why don't you go look up one of the drivers from the 1960s and 70s? I mean, these guys looked like they were in their mid 60s and they were in their late 20s, early 30s. I mean,
this is Jack Brabham in 1966. He could either be 20 or 70.
And I'll tell you another thing. He could either be a world-class F1 driver or a movie actor, or he could pick up trash on the weekends. Like, I have no idea. Looking at this guy, he could be so many different things. And that's what's hilarious about it.
All right, let's move into our last one. And this one will probably be our most controversial and most difficult, I think, to tie to how events changed F1. But we're going to give it a shot. So again, this whole video is about big events that changed F1, and I think the ones that we've listed out here are pretty clear and apparent. Either they were rule changes or how the sport looks or how the cars are designed or something like that. This one is more personal, drivers, teams, relationships, how you conduct yourself on and off the circuit. 2008 Singapore Grand Prix. What is it known as?
That would be Crashgate. Ooh.
Crashgate.
Is that what you're about to cover?
Yeah. So one of our viewers on TikTok had brought up that we didn't bring this up in fraudulent races. And I said, good point. Fraudulent races is more about the FIA kind of messing people over or races that you just kind of left you with a bad taste in your mouth, not necessarily drivers impeding other drivers or crashing or things like that. So we thought we'd bring it up here. Old Fernando Alonso. Fernando Alonso and Nelson Piquet Jr. were the two drivers for Renault, and they were going into the Singapore Grand Prix, and Fernando Alonso was the points leader at the time for the team, and so they were trying to help him. And this was still in Fernando Alonso's kind of like peak time where he is, he's still kind of recently off championships. He was competing with Lewis a couple years before. Like, he's still in the mix for being a world-class driver. As they're going around the race, it is apparent that Fernando is not going to win or get the points that he needs. So Nelson Piquet crashes at a critical spot on the circuit where there happens to be really no marshals around, no crane to come and pick him up. This follows a safety car, right? And the safety car allows Fernando Alonso to catch back up to the pack. He's able to make a couple more overtakes. Alonso actually won the race. He gets points that he wouldn't have otherwise gotten without this safety car caused by his teammate Nelson Piquet Jr. And I specify Nelson Piquet Jr. because he's looked upon negatively in the F1 community, whereas Nelson Piquet Sr. is looked upon very favorably in the community. So there's a difference. So the race ends, and the season ends, and Nelson Piquet Jr. actually leaves Renault. He goes on to pursue other ventures. And then some news starts happening, some rumblings within the paddock.
Okay.
It might have been on purpose that Nelson Piquet Jr. crashed where he did when he did. And again, this is all after the season. This is the crazy part. Like, this wasn't
after
like day
the
of.
Season? Oh, I thought this was after the race on the day of.
No, there were rumblings after the race, like, oh, he crashed and it helped Fernando, but everybody kind of left it at that.
Oh my gosh!
This all took place after the season. He had left Renault. He wasn't on Renault when all this went down. So there's some rumblings that, hey, it was mentioned, I think, on a Brazilian TV station. Like, we have evidence that says Nelson Piquet Jr., who's Brazilian, might have done this on purpose or under team orders. So the FIA launches a committee to investigate this. And it comes down that it's found out that Nelson Piquet Jr. was ordered by the executive director and racing director of Renault to crash in that very specific spot on the track. Couple things wrong with this. One, this is 2009, and as Jeremiah has covered a couple of times now, team orders were banned. So I don't really know if this is a team order, but kind of is in a roundabout way.
Essentially it is.
Telling you to crash to benefit your teammate. And also, you can't intentionally harm yourself, harm others, or damage property, even in F1. That is against the rules. And in a lot of countries, like in Singapore, it's against the law, which there's criminal legal stuff here too. So, Nelson Piquet just gets torched by the F1 community essentially for speaking up on this matter. Nelson Piquet and the Piquets in general sue Renault. Renault sues the FIA and sues the Piquets, all because he crashed to benefit Alonso. And it does come out, Renault eventually does admit that they did order Piquet to crash in that specific spot. So how is this an event that changed F1? Think about this from a driver personnel perspective. Nelson Piquet can't work again in Formula One, per Martin Brundle. He said this. Martin Brundle said that he's too controversial to employ. And the way that I read his statements were that Nelson Piquet stirred up trouble where he shouldn't have. Essentially, if you're a driver for an F1 team, you go out and you do what the team says, and you just don't mention it anymore. Like if Nelson Piquet had always said and always maintained that Renault didn't tell him to do that, nothing would have come of this.
Right.
But it's the fact that he eventually came around and said, yeah, they told me to do it, that caused the problem. The other thing that it did is there's a lot of instances now, and the most recent example I'll use is last year in the Dutch Grand Prix, Yuki Tsunoda had a lot of issues.
Yeah, and everybody was trying to blame Red Bull for that.
Right, because it was ultimately going to help Max somehow get more
whatever.
points. But Yuki had like a seatbelt issue, and then his tire was loose, and then all this other stuff came out. Maybe, but you're running a huge risk as a team doing that, because not only are you going to get sued, you're going to get fined, you could get suspended, you could get banned from the sport, you could have, in the case of the PKs, criminal charges filed against you for intentionally crashing and endangering yourself and others. There is a huge risk to run that was all uncovered in 2009, which tarnished a guy's career. It made Renault get slapped with so many fines. Renault was actually temporarily banned and then had to come back, and they were suspended. It's crazy that they're still even a team. All the people involved in this at Renault, the executive director and the director of operations, they got banned indefinitely from the sport of F1, so they can't even come back and be employed by a team. No team is going to risk that today.
Yeah, and that's kind of why Yuki was under the magnifying glass in the first place. Nobody would have accused him of anything even close to this had not happened already in 2008 in Singapore. So, that being said, you had just mentioned that the director had gone and the team principal had gone. That was Flavio Briatore. And Flavio, I don't know what you know about this guy, but he was sorry if this offends some people, but scumbag, for lack of a better word.
Is he the one fixing races?
Yes, he's the guy that basically any kind of controversy that you can think of in the history of Formula One can almost all be tied back to Flavio Briatore. And there's a reason why he hasn't been in anything involved in Formula One as far as having an employment in the sport itself since.
Race fixing checks out. That's like, predetermining the outcome of an event or a sport or something like that. And that's basically what they did in the Singapore Grand Prix, telling Piquet to crash. They were determining the race. They were getting Fernando boosted up the standings where he shouldn't have otherwise been. I wish we were fans of the sport back then.
Because I was alive back then. I mean, come on.
I wish there was Drive to Survive back then, because imagine the 2009 Drive to Survive season, the first episode, Crashgate, Nelson Piquet's face like slandered on a newspaper somewhere.
Here I was watching baseball. I could have been watching Formula One.
So yeah, that's our top five though. We had 2021 Abu Dhabi with the removal of race directors, 2011 season adding DRS and lifting team orders bans, the 68 edition of livery sponsorships, which immediately rolled into the cigarette era of Formula One, the 1959 Cooper Cars team moving the engine from the front to the rear, which every team then immediately copied. And then finally, the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix with Crashgate, which just led to the tumultuous relationship between teams and drivers, lawsuits, and what you can and can't do in a race. If you have any thoughts or comments on any of the things that we've listed here, or if you want to correct me on the year of any other race that I've messed up, certainly let us know in the comments below.
Guys, if you want to see Flavio Briatore be the new team principal of Ferrari,
It would be Ferrari too, wouldn't
Right.
it?
And if you want to see Mercedes wheel out their brand new innovation of the jet turbine engine, let us know down below because I think I agree with you.
All right, guys, we'll see you.
Bye, guys.